Phil, in your book, which you call The First Casualty, you trace the development of the art of war reporting and the development of war correspondence. You were referring to the fact that the first casualty in war is the truth, as I understand. Who said that?
Senator Hiram Johnson, U.S. Senator, 1917, and he's referring to what was about to happen to reporting of the First World War.
Where did it all begin?
It began in Crimea, a war between Britain and Russia. Before then, it was customary for newspapers to take their reports of battles from the generals who fought them. But that obviously had disadvantages. The generals naturally overplayed their victories and underplayed their defeats. So the Times, at the outbreak of the Crimean War, had the idea of sending this rather wild Irishman, William Howard Russell, to accompany the British troops sailing to fight the Russians. Now the military didn't like this idea because they'd had the preserve of what went on at war to themselves. And the tendency had always been that you told the public at home only what it needed to know, that the war had started, our troops had gone, and then when the war was over you told them who won. Russell, on the spot, was able for the first time to convey to the reading public back home exactly what it was like at the battlefront. And of course the British Army in those days was a rather inefficient, hide-bound with tradition army, and the suffering of the ordinary soldiers was enormous. The military, the facilities that they provided for hospital care for the wounded were almost non-existent. The discipline was so strict that it was possible for a soldier to be flogged for not having his top button on his jacket done up. And Russell, who'd, although a military man himself, was absolutely shocked to find out what was happening. And he wrote it as he saw it. And the Times, to its credit, printed it, and it led to the fall of the government of the day. And it proved so successful. I mean, he told the truth for the first time about what it was really like to be at the front, that by 3 or 4 years later, when the American Civil War started, 500 correspondents alone turned up to report the northern side. And the business was away, and it then became one of the great growth industries of the last 130 years.
How did the military react to the presence of the correspondents?
They didn't like it at first because they didn't quite understand that the pressures on a journalist for drama, for fact, for interesting human interest stories didn't help the military in its efforts to fight a secret war. I mean, the interests of the two are quite definitely opposed. Mm-hmm. The military is interested in surprise, deception. That's the way you win battles. Newspapers are interested in disclosure. So the interests of war correspondents in the military have always been diametrically opposed.
What was the level of expertise from a military point of view, or what was the level of education of those reporters who initially went out in the early wars?
Well, Russell had had a bit of experience himself. He was a failed soldier. There was a tendency in the early days to try and employ military men because it was felt that they would have A, better chance of being accepted by the military, and B, some idea of what was going on. And by the time the First World War came around, because the military had also realized that one way of subtle censorship, of getting your point of view over, was to absorb the correspondent into the military machine. So in the First World War you had only six British correspondents allowed, and they were all given the honorary rank of captain. They were all provided with batmen, conducting officers, they wore uniform, they lived in chateaus with the general staff, and they became virtually part of the general staff. Now that had a disastrous effect on their writing. I mean, they associated them so closely with the British Army that they lauded its victories and played down its defeats and kept from the British public the slaughter on the Western Front until after the war was over.
Well, during World War I, did that change at any time? Were American reporters permitted in later on in the war? When
America entered the war, the American correspondents did their best to, in the American tradition of an open and free society and the freedom of the press to report as guaranteed by the Constitution, to try and tell the true story of what was going on. Now they rapidly ran into difficulty as well because the senior Allied partner, Britain and France, believed in total censorship, total control of the news. And they succeeded in persuading General Pershing that much the same thing should apply to American correspondents. And the more conscientious of American correspondents just packed up and went home. They said, this is a war we can't report.
Do you recall who those correspondents were who quit and came back?
Well, one of the best known, of course, was Richard Harding Davis, the highest paid correspondent of his day, earning the equivalent of $100,000 a year. Always traveled first class across the Atlantic, had a marvelous coonskin coat, very swashbuckling figure. And he arrived with some panache to cover the American involvement in World War I in France. I think he lasted about 2 months. Couldn't write anything, they wouldn't let him go anywhere. His reputation meant nothing, so he packed up and went home. I think Hemingway put it rather well. He said in the First World War you either joined the army, wrote propaganda, or stayed at home. The whole terrible tragedy of the reporting of World War I is that if only the public had had the knowledge of what was really happening on the Western Front, the mechanized slaughter of millions to gain a few yards of territory, then it is doubtful they would have been prepared to continue support for the war. It's quite possible that the war might have been over a lot earlier, a negotiated peace. And I mean, if you want to take the roll-on effect from that, then there wouldn't have been that terrible Treaty of Versailles which led directly to the Second World War. That's a long view, but certainly if the reporting had been better, then I don't think the war would have gone on as long as it did.
Well, as you know, I was a correspondent in World War II, but that was an entirely different matter. As I recall, it was a reasonably open war. Would you agree?
Yes, because it was a different situation. The vital factor, different factor in World War II was a war of national survival, in which the wickedness of the enemy didn't have to be invented. They really were nasty people. So correspondents had no difficulty reconciling their professional demands of writing what they saw and what they believed to be true with getting on side to the extent that they too wanted to be part of the war effort. I mean, they wanted the Allies to win. So they didn't do anything that would have too greatly imperiled the war effort. And within that, those fairly wide boundaries, you could write virtually what you wanted to.
As I recall, in the Korean War, which I covered, our censorship setup was almost identical to what we had in World War II. I think it was reported probably with the same accuracy as World War II.
Yes, I would agree with that, with the addition, of course, that because it was a United Nations war, that it was possible to report from the other side. Mm-hmm. So for the first time you had correspondents or citizens of the countries involved in the war actually reporting from the enemy side. That caused some stir at the time, but of course it was a precursor to what occurred in Vietnam.
The Korean War was pretty much the same as World War II. I covered the Korean War, and as I recall, our censorship was almost identical to what existed in the Second World War. Would you agree?
Yes, the same system ran, with one addition, that because it was a United Nations war, it was possible for correspondents from individual countries to report the war from the other side without committing treason. So for the first time you had correspondents, a British correspondent, I think there was one American as well, certainly 2 British correspondents, reported from the North Korean side, a sort of lead up to what occurred in Vietnam as well.
I recall meeting one of those correspondents at Panmunjom, Australian,
yes,
Wilfred Burchett.
Yes, Wilfred Burchett. Yes.
And at that time it was a strange experience for those of us to suddenly meet someone from the other side in the middle of the road, so to speak. The war in Vietnam was a different kettle of fish, though, was it not, insofar as reporting was concerned?
Yes, a very unusual war from a journalist's point of view, and I think in the long history of wars and war correspondence, an aberration. Because there'd been no declaration of war, the American government gave to all the correspondents there absolute total freedom of movement to go where they wanted to go, to report what they wanted to report. There was no censorship at all. So correspondents did exactly that. Now, I don't think when the military realized, I think when the military gave them that freedom, they didn't realize what its long-term effects would be. And as one of the critics of the reporting of Vietnam, Robert Elegant says, for the first time it was possible for a correspondent to get on side with the other side. Now, he takes that a little further and says that may have actually cost America the war. I don't think it was quite as serious as that, but what happened in Vietnam has certainly been looked at with great interest by other countries about the risk that you run in giving television cameras and correspondents absolutely free rein without any restrictions to report on what they report whatsoever.
Well, I understand there was pretty good cooperation between the press and the military, as you've just outlined, in the early days of the war, but the adversary relationship did develop as time went on, and that the patriotism of some of the correspondents was called into question by some of the military. That must have been a real problem for the reporters.
Yes, what happened was that the military didn't realize that the interests of the correspondent and theirs were not the same. And once the correspondents began to say, well, things are not going as well as the military is saying, and to write what they saw with their own eyes, which contradicted what the military was telling its high command in Washington, then this adversarial role developed. But you should stress that that occurred only at top level, because in the field there is a natural identification that a correspondent feels with the troops with whom he's living and for whom he relies upon for his sustenance and often protection for his life. So it was only at a high level. In other words, we're talking about the overall view of the war. There was this adversarial role. In the day-by-day reporting of it, I think the correspondents naturally and understandably identified with the troops about whom they were writing.
However, there were two sources of information, two groups of correspondents, if you will, who were working in the Vietnam War, those in Washington who covered the Pentagon and those in Vietnam. Was there any conflict?
Enormous conflict. The trouble was not with the correspondent or necessarily with the Pentagon, because one recognizes what the Pentagon's interests are. The correspondents were writing what they saw. The Pentagon was leaning on or providing information to the Washington correspondents. The editor was getting two different sorts of information. Now, he tended to believe what he was getting from his Washington correspondent, which is totally against all the principles of journalism. Because if you're not going to believe your man on the spot, why bother to send him in the first place? And this is where the whole press message was called developed. That the correspondent in the field saw things with his own eyes, heard things with his own ears, wrote it as truly and as faithfully as he could, only to find that when it appeared in the newspaper or a magazine or on screen, his editor had taken the Washington line.
Then did that editor bring pressure on the man in the field to change what he was writing?
That was the very fact that the story he'd sent had not appeared, and another story had appeared, is pressure in itself, because a correspondent is naturally anxious to please his editor. He wants to get his stuff into print. I mean, that's part of being the buzz of being in the business, is seeing what you've written appear. And when it doesn't appear, that is a subtle form of pressure.
But in the long view, with the benefit of hindsight, what was the quality of reporting from the Vietnam War, in your opinion?
Overall, very good. Because in the long history of war correspondence, an aberration. I don't think ever again will correspondents be given such freedom to write, such freedom to film, and will never have the audience or the opportunity to write like that again. I mean, look what's happened. If we just jump ahead a little bit, there is no access anymore. There's a war going on in Afghanistan, nobody can write about it because you can't get there. There's a war going on between Iran and Iraq, you can't write about it because you can't get there. There was a war in the Falklands, which was written and reported very poorly because you couldn't get there.
Well, you say that there won't be this freedom in the future. But how, with modern communications, with instant communication, you might say, from the farthest point in the world, how can you maintain a censorship? You can't do it in the classic tradition. You could only do it by not permitting the correspondent to go there, as in the Falklands, huh?
Yes, I think if you look, the rules that Britain adopted in the Falklands turned out to be amazingly simple. You deny access to neutral correspondence. Now, it was fortunate that that was the sort of war that was possible to do, although the original idea was to deny access to all correspondence. You permit those to go from your own country. You vet them beforehand. When you're there, you rely on their natural sense of identification with the troops that they're with to write only stories that are laudatory of what those troops are doing. And at home, you suppress any dissent by appeals to patriotism and by attacking those who do show dissent as being traitors. Simple as that.
What?
Yeah. It worked.
It worked indeed. And I think that, I'm afraid, although the constitutional guarantees of the United States worked in Vietnam and the press was free and the reporting was brilliant, those constitutional guarantees will be under threat if there's ever another instance like that of Vietnam.
Do you think that that perhaps is the only way you can get people to go to war in the future? I'm thinking of what television did in Vietnam and in the Korean War too. It showed the terribleness of war. It probably robbed war of a lot of its romance and made it less popular with the populace. Do you think that it will be necessary to keep the truth away, to get people involved in future hostilities?
It has already happened. I mean, one of the main forms of censorship in Britain during the Falklands campaign was the deliberate delaying and eventual suppression of any too horrific film footage. Now, the suppression was twofold. It was delayed by the government, but there's also the risk that the media will censor itself, and using for reasons for doing so very justifiable in a way and laudable ones, that you don't want to upset the relatives of the person who may be dying on screen in your living room. But there is the risk also in doing this that you sanitize war, and that by removing its horror you thus prepare the populace for the next war.
So in summation, what you're saying, that in time of war, the freedom of the press is a thing of the past.
I'm afraid that it's certainly at risk. I wouldn't say it's totally gone, but it is at this moment more at risk than it's ever been in the whole 130-year history of war correspondence.